contributed amendments to the state code. And so the contributed amendments all had to be in sync with what is currently state law and you know, what is out there under Title 19 and other elements of the state code. They finally were able to bring all these amendments together and publish the international code as a brand new code. Thank you. And when they republish the international code, they then rename it, and it's called the 2007 California Fire Code. So the 2007 California Fire Code.
The music denotes that we're working here.
We actually cue that music for when we say 2007
it's
California
very
Fire
dramatic, Mr. Fire Marshal.
It'll come up every time I say that. In any case, and as you can tell, we are working on a PowerPoint here, but the PowerPoint really isn't going to say much more than what I'm telling you, you know, offhand here. And that is that we finally have this 2007 California Fire Code that will be adopted. It has been approved, and it will go into effect on January 1st of 2008. That's for the state of California. Now we get down to local adoption. And the local adoption element is where we are allowed to adopt more stringent measures based on our own needs, local needs, than the state of California. We're not allowed to take any of the California amendments and make them less strict, but we can go more strict, similar to what we used to do with the old uniform code. It's been a long time since anyone in California has adopted a code. I think 2002 was when we last adopted the fire code. The state has been working on this since 2005. So it's a new code to the state. It's a new code to us. And what we set about to do is make it as simple as possible from the amendment point of view. We didn't want to over-amend a code that we haven't been working with for years. I don't know if I mentioned, but the uniform codes have been in place for almost 40 years. And that's the code we're familiar with. So we're looking at a brand new code, and what we're trying to do is figure out what we need at a bare minimum to adopt it to the local needs. Some of the local needs, as you can well imagine, center around our high fire area. Some of them center around, you know, our downtown congestion. Some of them center around transportation needs, like the transportation corridor of 101, north and southbound, which tends to isolate us, as you know, in the event of an emergency. So we have developed a few minor amendments, and at this point I'm able to skip ahead. I talked about the California Building Standards Commission. The commission adopts under Title 24 of the California Code of Regulations, and that's where the fire code falls. It's also where the building code falls. As you know, we're being followed by the building department, and they have somewhat of a tougher job than we have. They have a lot more codes to adopt than we do. But they all fall under our Title 24. It has 12 parts, including health, safety, life safety, and general welfare. So these are the codes that are in question for the state: the International Building Code, the International Fire Code, the National Electrical Code, and the Uniform Mechanical and Plumbing Code. I talked a little bit about how these standards are compiled. They come from 3 different sources. The building standards that are adopted straight up by the state agencies as section by section, verbatim from the International Code. They're adopted code sections that need to be modified somewhat to meet state requirements. And then finally, there are actual additions by the state legislature or existing measures under the state law that are simply incorporated into these various codes. I talked about the different agencies involved. One of the things that I didn't mention is that the adoption process itself is one of the largest tasks ever undertaken by these agencies in the state of California, just because of the complexity of adopting a brand new code and making it mesh with all of California law. An example is that DSA alone had 64 pages of stakeholders who wanted a say in the new adoption process. And, they range from government agencies to private to construction to all kinds of different people who had a stake in the outcome of the adoption of the codes. What they finally come up with is their final express terms, which are the state amendments. And then I was talking about how they bring them together with the state code, and they publish them, in our case, on the 2007 California Fire Code under Title 24, Part 9. The building code, as you'll learn later, is Title 24, Part 2. So they were published in July. They take effect in January, and we have to be more restrictive. And our amendments have to be based on topographic, geological, or climatic reasons. And I think in the adopting ordinance, we've led off with our findings in the code.
I have a quick question. I thought I just heard you say that we must be more restrictive. Is it that we can, if we like, but we can meet these standards on their face?
Madam Chair, exactly. If we want to accept the California Code, in fact, we don't have to go through the adoption process at all. We can simply accept what the code requires in January.
But the moment we become more restrictive, we have to go through the process.
Exactly.
I see.
So the recommended adoption is actually the California Fire Code, which is the 2007 California Fire Code, which is an amended version of the 2006 International Code, and with amendments, it will become, hopefully, the Santa Barbara Fire Code. And that the amendments refer to the ordinance that you have in the attached matrix. Some of our changes re-adopt the local building and fire code appeals section. We've always had our own appeals section that we have jointly with the building department. It's worked well for us for many years. So we've agreed on language, added some accessibility requirements that are now required under state law, and we have the same appeals language for both building and fire. Another example is we deleted and modified certain sections relating to barbecues. We've deleted certain sections and chapters that either conflict with state law or local requirements. And one element about that, in the fire code, not all of the elements of the fire code relate to building standards. And when California adopts the fire code, they only adopt building standards. So, for instance, we have a couple of chapters, for instance, Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, that don't actually apply to building standards. They apply more to practice, precautions with fire and that sort of thing. The state, by rule, doesn't adopt those. We have the option to adopt them or not adopt them, depending on local conditions, and we can do that without findings. We can just adopt it by reference, which we do at the top of the ordinance, and then if there are sections in there that we don't agree with or can't apply locally, we simply omit them, and we've done that in a couple of cases in this adopting ordinance. We maintain local development requirements for access from fire hydrants, and we maintain mixed-use occupancy signs and mixed-use fire alarm systems, which are two elements that grew out of the increased density in the downtown area and the whole mixed-use concept of placing residential on top of commercial in the downtown area. And both of those things help us locate and get people out in the event that there's a problem in a commercial occupancy in the middle of the night when the commercial occupancy is empty. We maintain our local prohibition against safe and sane fireworks. State law actually allows that. So we have to, again, being more stringent, we have to put our own ordinance together that basically prohibits sparklers and those types of fireworks. And then we strengthen our local urban wildland interface requirements for defensible space and vegetation management by adopting our own sections under Chapter 47 of this code. And it also identifies the City of Santa Barbara Wildland Fire Plan as the controlling document, and that, as you know, is the document that you adopted in 2004. The state allows us to define our own areas and define how we're approaching the wildland urban interface area. And so that's what we do. We identify our own wildland fire plan as the controlling document for Chapter 47.
Mr. House has a question for you.
On that, with the wildland fire plan, that the assessment area is a certain segment of our geographic area. But the plan itself, is that, when you say that's a controlling document, is that citywide or just for the area that decided to assess themselves?
That's citywide. And
Okay.
that identifies all of the urban interface areas, including the coastal zone. You're correct. The Prop 218, the thing that you were referring to, defines the foothill and the extreme foothill zones as the Prop 218 area. And the wildland fire plan addresses all of the wildland urban interface
I see.
areas.
Okay, so then that controls any area that would be of that nature with those kinds of fuels and that kind of topography and that.
Correct.
I see.
Yes, Councilmember House, if I may, thank you, Madam Chair. That was probably one of the most significant things that we did with respect to this adoption is, a couple of years ago you did adopt the Wildland Fire Plan, and it had a lot of recommendations for fire-resistive construction, vegetation management, some very specific things. Through this process, we're actually integrating those concepts into part of our code, so we have some enforcement capacity to make sure that the Wildland Fire Plan tenets can be carried out and we can actually enforce. So this is an important aspect to this particular adoption.
Thank you very much.
So the current schedule we're on is if recommended for adoption, introduction on November 13th and adoption before the full City Council on November 20th. Our code is written, our ordinance is written to take effect on the same date as the state code, January 1 of 2008. And we'd like to say at this time that we also plan to bring you in 2008 a more stringent sprinkler ordinance that will cover all residential, basically all construction. And that isn't a part of this because it's something that we wanted to keep separate so that we could, have plenty of time to have any stakeholders come out and address that issue. But that is something that we would like to bring to you in 2008. The next cycle for the state will include green building standards that bring state requirements up to meet federal regulations. And, of course, additional input from stakeholders. The state of California is also still attempting to sort through the errata and various things that either didn't get picked up or things that they want to strengthen in the fire code, building code, and plumbing code and everything else. And so they're adopting kind of an annual cycle where they're going to review how the codes are doing and what they need to add, at least for the first couple of years. And then it will be back to a 3-year adoption cycle pretty much for the state and everybody else. And hopefully we'll kind of be back to business as usual where we have a code that, we add to in a minor way as the years go on, but we use as a base code on a regular, for a regular business. We also expect that at some point there'll be further adjustments to our local ordinances, but for now we think we have it covered. And with that, I'll take any questions that you have.
Thank you very much. Is there anything you'd like to add, Chief?
Actually, I think Joe covered it pretty well. It's a pretty complex process. This is probably the most wide-sweeping reforms I've seen in my 34 years in the fire service in terms of coming up with a brand-new code. We've been using the same code and just modifications of that and readopting it every 3 years for literally the last 3 or 4 decades. So this is using international codes is something it's great on a national perspective. People are getting on the same page, but it's very complex to do this initial adoption. And hopefully you could follow the presentation. And if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer.
Great. First of all, I don't have any speaker slips, and I don't see any members of the public here in the audience. If somebody would like to make a comment, please do it now. Seeing none, Mr. Barnwell.
I just want to say thanks. There's a lot of trust going on here because I have no idea what all this is about. But I know you guys do, and I know the state has been looking at it. So my comments are zero. When I looked at it, I wouldn't have any way to argue for or against. So pretty much trust in you guys, and I have to, that's good. So.
We do trust
Councilman
our
Barnwell,
firefighters.
thank you. We have, if it makes you feel any better, we've had all the fire prevention staff working on this since January. So we've had a lot of good professional input into what we should change and what
When
we
they're
shouldn't
not out
change.
fighting wildland fires.
When they're not doing that.
Mr. House.
First, I want to thank you very much for the matrix in our staff report. That's helpful. And I just had a couple of things. One, you mentioned the fire sprinklers, and in here, if I understand it correctly, we're amending, one of our amendments is to insert our already more stringent fire sprinkler requirements.
That's correct.
Okay, so we're not losing any ground that we've gained in the past. We're going to retain and continue. Is that true across the board, that we are holding on to anything that we already have that's essentially more stringent, or am I overgeneralizing?
No, that's true. And that was part of our goal, is to make sure that we hung on to things that we had. In some areas, the state caught up. And I think you'll see in the building code in Chapter 7A, the high fire construction requirements, we actually were able to let go of things because they had put them in that code.
Okay, great. On the mixed use piece, which is Chapter 9, let's see, Section 907.1.5, with the fire alarm requirement. So if I understand this correctly, the business that may be closed downstairs in a mixed-use environment, maybe they could have a fire or something starts up, and the residents above wouldn't know otherwise. So you're making a requirement here that there be some way to alert residents above that there could be some problem down below.
That's right. Usually automatic smoke detection is not required in that type of a business. And we don't require it also in businesses that are freestanding without residences attached. But we found in the 80s and 90s that a couple of things were happening, and that's that there could be a fire in a commercial business with people living upstairs, and they would not know it until it was very late in the game. And then the other thing was that we would have people who are living in these mixed-use situations who would have medical emergencies. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, the engine company would roll up and they would find a business and not know exactly how to get to the residential, or even if there was a residential occupancy. And so we started putting the residential occupancy signs and the fire alarm systems in these mixed-use situations, and it served us pretty well. So we did want to keep that.
Very good. Are there any other requirements in terms of fire hydrants or availability of water when there's a mixed-use environment?
The requirements are basically the commercial requirements. So in other words, we don't allow the residential water requirements.
Okay, very good. Question about the last item here in our on our list, and it was repealing a section having to do with explosives and blasting agents and things like that. Well, what replaces that?
We actually moved the explosive section. The state has an explosive section, and what we did was we repealed 8.040 because it's addressed elsewhere in the code, and we moved it to the explosives and fireworks section of the state code.
Understood. Okay. And then lastly, something that's not here, and maybe it's a chance to ask about it. There was a fire over on the corner of Haley. It was Comer and Adams when they went up in flames, and by some magic, the little dwellings next door didn't get. Maybe it wasn't magic. Maybe it was skill. The dwellings next door did not burn down. Anyway, I remember on Planning Commission we would once in a while talk about the amount of time that the requirement for a wall that will hold up for an hour or for some period of time. Are those requirements in our code the same as they've always been, or are they being changed in any way?
That's a very interesting question, and I'm going. I'll defer to my building code colleagues back here to talk about that in greater depth than I can. But the building code changes a lot of those requirements. I don't want to say dramatically, but significantly.
In the direction that we would want. I mean, is this acceptable to the fire department that it's moving in that direction, or is it a lower requirement?
I think that the best interpretation that I've heard on it, and again, I'll let them flesh this out a little more, but the best interpretation I've heard is that this new building code likes to require sprinklers in lieu of situations like that,
really?
so that while the construction remains the same, the need in the area that you can, by area I mean the size of the square footage where you need it, it has actually increased in a lot of cases.
So this is an interface between the fire code and the building code. Well, they're both building code in this case, but that's where they come together, really,
yes.
right there.
And this has been, there are elements of what you're talking about that have been pretty controversial at the state level. So the state, and this is one of those areas where the state is going to continually monitor that situation to see how it works out. But it hasn't been without controversy.
In that particular case, in that particular fire, that was what I would consider a non-conforming use as well. Obviously, the building had been there for a long time. Now, if you were to try to build a building on the property line like that or within a few feet, the requirements for openings, frankly, you wouldn't be able to have openings in it. So and those folks were very lucky, but also we had an exposure line down that alleyway to try to protect those houses. And so it was skill on our part, but it's certainly nothing you'd want to design in new construction.
Thank you for addressing that. I just was thinking in Santa Barbara, we're not a great city, but we have an urban core, and we have commercial development, and the residential development in a mixed-use environment is we're not requiring the same kind of setbacks in some situations. So I'm just thinking about and if there's any assistance you need from us. I mean, sounds like the fire code isn't really addressing that. That's going to be something we'll be speaking with Mr. Estrella about in the building code side of it. Right?
Mr. Estrella is on deck.
Okay, we'll deal with that next. And thank you very much, and very much appreciate this, helping lay people like ourselves try to understand this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'm glad to add my words of support and thanks to not only the work here, but also the thought that goes into it, the specificity that is unique to Santa Barbara and our wildland fire plan in particular, which covers more than just the wildland interface. So I think that may be addressing a little bit of what Mr. House was asking about, that it's a comprehensive document that speaks to the city as a whole, really. And we certainly have seen all of your good works in action over the last 8 months, because remember we had the Zaka fire going back into July, or I guess it's 6 months, where we had resources from all over the state, and I know that we sent resources all over the state down south, and we thank you all for all of that hard work, and we're very, very lucky to have a terrific force here in the city that keeps us safe. So thank you for this. Do you need a motion from us?
I believe what we did. I think we're
Give you the
asking
recommendation.
for a motion for full
I'll
council.
entertain a motion to adopt.
Yes, Madam Chair. I move that we recommend for approval to the City Council of the ordinance amending our Municipal Code, Chapter 8.04, et cetera, et cetera.
Second.
Any further discussion? Any further comments? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We'll forward this up with thumbs up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And again, congratulations. Mr. Estrella. It's also very gratifying to see how hand in glove the building department, the fire department, and all of our departments work. They work so closely together. It is a unit, and there may be different departments, but it's seamless. So I thank you for your cooperative endeavors. Mr. Estrella.
Thank you. Madam Chair, council members, my name is George Estrella, Chief Building Official managing the Building Safety Division. With me today, I have Mr. Chris Hansen, who is our plan check and counter supervisor, who will actually give the staff presentation. However, before that, I'd like to point out a few things to Ordinance Committee, and that is if you take a look at the adopting ordinance, one of the items that you would see would be the 2007 Energy Code. I'd just like to bring to your attention that these are in fact the same standards that are enforced today. It's just that the California Energy Commission just changed the title from 2005 to 2007. So we felt just to go ahead and bring that forward under the new name of the California Energy Code 2007 edition. The other items I'd like to bring to your attention also is that we've had much discussions with other agencies regarding the codes. Mr. Hansen has done extensive research as to potential amendments and application of the codes. They're quite extensive, as you heard from our fire personnel. There are sweeping changes that we are currently learning and will be enforcing as the implementation date comes forward. As such, we are also sponsoring some joint training workshops with our local AIA and Santa Barbara Contractors Association. So we'll be learning the codes together and designing buildings together, and of course enforcing these buildings as the date moves forward to January '08. With that, I'd just like to also just mention is that what are the purpose of the building codes? I think this is very important for our public to understand. We don't have these building codes or fire codes just simply because of, we want to stop construction or delay construction or drive construction costs up. Actually, the purpose of these codes are to provide minimum standards to safeguard life, limb, health, property, public welfare by regulating and controlling the design, construction, quality of materials, use and occupancy, location, and maintenance of all buildings in the city of Santa Barbara. So these are in place to protect the public welfare and hopefully save lives should an unfortunate incident occur. And of course, part of the adoption of the uniform codes has to do with energy and accessibility, electrical, plumbing, and mechanical codes. So that's also included in the codes that will be adopted. With that, at this time, I'd like to have Mr. Hanson provide the staff report.
Thank you. Mr. Hanson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Committee members, Chris Hansen, Plan Check Supervisor. First, I want to say now that George has made his brief introductory remarks, I don't have anything left to say. No. But to expound a little bit on what Joe Perea was talking about, we in California have been spoiled a little bit. Our last uniform building code came out in 1997, and we've made very few changes on a yearly basis since then. So we've been looking at almost the exact same codes with minor changes for 10 years. So we've kind of gotten really comfortable and used to these codes. And as George and Joe have both alluded to, the changes in the upcoming international codes and now the California codes are sweeping in nature. And to speak a little bit to Councilman House's earlier questions, I'm not sure how we could really give you a straight answer on that question, because to a lot of us it seems like the codes are getting a lot more liberal in what they're allowing, especially in the terms of openings and the distance to property lines. They're giving some trade-offs for sprinklers. They're giving trade-offs, whereas before it said if you were X number of feet, you either were allowed to have openings or not allowed to have openings. And now they're saying it's a percentage based on how far away from the property line. So if you're 5 feet, you can have 25% of your wall can be openings. If you're 10 feet, you can have 40% or something like that. So for a lot of these code changes, a lot of us are really going to have to learn a new paradigm. It feels uncomfortable. We've been going to classes now for almost a year since these we knew that back in last January that the codes were being adopted, and especially since July when the California state made their amendments published and available. We've been, going to classes. Sometimes it seems like to some of our developers to the detriment of our daily plan check work, because we're having to go to so much classes. But the changes are sweeping in a lot of respects, and we're still learning these. Normally we would come back to you every 3 years for this, but we're probably going to be back to you in 6 months and a year as we discover some of these things. As once January 1st comes in, these things start taking an effect, and we really have to start biting the bullet, so to speak. We've been also a strange dichotomy in the last year where that we've been going to this training, but we're still having to plan check on our old codes, and probably for the next year, because these new codes won't apply to plans that are submitted before January 1st, we're going to have two codes in mind as we're doing, so it's going to be quite a confusing year for us. As you can see in front of you, our draft ordinance is quite long. It looks like it's a whole lot of changes. I do have to tell you that the majority of this is the grading section, which is, I handed out a little matrix for you. I couldn't let the fire department outdo me on that, and so I gave it to you both in a text version and a table version. But our grading is Section 9. It's going to be Appendix J, and because it is an appendix, we don't have to make findings. This particular language was taken from our current code language on the grading, and is also what was recommended by the Southern California Grading Officials Association in response to what the upcoming code's weak nature of the grading ordinance is. Most of the other things in this ordinance are keeping requirements that we currently have in our adopting ordinance and bringing them on forward, and with very few exceptions, are we really doing anything different. Under the building code and the executive summary, the eave protection, while we're deleting that, it's because, you know, the fire department's wildland fire plan takes care of that and is actually a little bit different, so we can make it more consistent to have it in one place. The efficiency dwelling unit was a separate ordinance that was passed back in 2003 to allow a smaller sized room in a dwelling unit that was used for housing authority projects. We've brought that now into this, so it won't be a separate ordinance. We've kept, like Joe said, our high fire hazard ordinance has gone away completely because the new building code contains everything in there except for one section, and so the roof requirements was brought into this, so that now, just like before, all roofs in high fire hazard areas have to be Class A or non-combustible. State building code allowed Class A or B and didn't require non-combustible. We've brought forward the roofing requirements any place else in the city. The minimum is Class B. The state would allow non-classified roofs in some occupancies, and we don't do that. The plumbing code and the electrical code were the only thing we really did was bring in the Board of Appeals into one code, into the building code, and modified it so that it maintained our current language as we've been using for the last several years. As Joe said, it's a joint building and fire code Board of Appeals. It now includes housing and accessibility appeals. With that, I've given you a real brief, glossy look over something that is, for us, going to change the way we do business as we know it. It's going to mean a lot of changes on the details of plans and the way plans are drawn. We're going to see a lot more people in their projects building property line to property line, wanting to go the mixed use occupancies. And so to answer previous questions, it's hard to say whether the new code is going to be more stringent, less stringent, or if these trade-offs are of equal value. We'll see. We'll be able to flesh that out over the next 6 months to a year, and be able to come back to you with if we feel that there's any changes that need to be made. With that, I'm open for any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Again, I have no speaker slips. I see no members of the public in the room. And so it's back to the council, Mr. House.
Thank you, Madam Chair. But the same rule applies here, and that is that if we locally feel that we would prefer to have what we would feel is a more stringent requirement in terms of fire safety, especially with regards to like these openings on the sides of structures that are very close to one another, those kinds of things, then we have the freedom to do that with their approval. Am I correct in that process?
Yes, as long as we can make findings based on climatic, geographic, or topographic.
I see. Very clear. Okay. Well, then also to the issue of roofs we were talking about a moment ago. One of the key things that we've noticed, I guess, is that they keep calling out is that you have the closed eaves and things like that. Is that included in here, or is that restricted? Is that just a recommendation for people building a home or putting a new roof on?
That was a lot of that was amended by the state and actually deleted by the state, and we've deleted a little bit of the 1 hour protection on eaves because some of the requirements of where you can have eaves in the first place, you're only allowed within, so far from the property line, it's been pulled back and things like that. So a lot of that, and with the fire plan, there was conflicts and it was handled elsewhere in the code. So it looks like we deleted that section from Chapter 7A, but it's been picked up elsewhere in the code.
Okay, I guess just sort of what I'm looking for are places where by some mischance we've diluted some previous protections and previous quality requirements that we have here sort of in deference to a statewide, where they're building big subdivisions out in the middle of nowhere. It's really quite different from a built-out city like the city of Santa Barbara, where we have homes very close together, and excuse me, like that. So are we, maybe it's a general question, are we giving away some things in adopting this new
The intention
code?
is not to. The intention is not to. But by the same token, our philosophy in the building department is to try and keep our ordinance simple so that our development community has the same rules and regulations and consistency as our neighboring communities would, so that those that work in Montecito, those that work in Santa Maria have the same rules. We hope not to have lessened any requirements.
Right. I mean, I think the consistency we would want would be more of a continuity in terms of our own fairly steep standards, and then have some way to communicate those distinctions to those who are coming through the process and over the counter. By the way, this is a little different from over in Goleta and Montecito. We just want to alert you to these particular things. With regards to grading, I see quite a bit on grading in here. And if I'm reading the matrix correctly, the real change has to do with a written report for the engineer. Am I reading that correctly? And the architect or am I reading the wrong one? What are the key things that are changing in the area of grading?
Madam Chair, Committeeman House, that particular one was a carryover from our existing ordinance to require a written report from the engineer or architect that's doing the observations. We don't have and haven't in the past done a lot of grading inspections ourselves, so we require these inspections to be done by the civil engineer, the architect, or an independent entity that the owner hires, and to clarify that they hand us a copy of all of those reports.
Well, the reason that jumped out at me was that during the 2 terms on the Planning Commission that I managed to get through, and it was surprising at how many times grading issues kind of surfaced, and many of them were those after-the-fact kind of things. They'd done some really stupid thing, and then we were there in this cleanup mode, and so the clarity and the ease of enforcement, to me, is a key component of, I would think, and we could be essentially almost preemptive in a way, kind of get ahead of the whole thing and have them have a better understanding of what we're asking for, and also the inspectors to have a really good chance at catching it when they blow it, when they make a mistake. Are there any improvements here, or is it pretty much the same that we've had all along? That would help us in terms of doing the right thing in the first place, and then for the inspectors to be able to catch it if they've made mistakes.
Madam Chair, Committeeman House, I feel that this gives us a lot more tools than we used to have, especially the items that we incorporated from the California Grading Officials Association, and a lot of those folks are down in Southern California where they do have a lot of grading that they keep, and they have their own grading departments and everything else, and so they're used to having a grading ordinance that gives them tools. And I believe, while, like you say, we don't have a lot of projects in the city that require massive amounts of grading, but when the 1 or 2 pop up that we do, we now have the tools to be able to be a little bit more proactive, a little better in control, especially at the plan check stage, to make sure that we're not assuming and just letting them go off and do what they need to do prior.
All right. Well, that's really good to hear. I hear Mr. Vincent. I just want to comment that this is really good to hear, because it was kind of a problem, recurring problem. Mr. Strayer recalls, and we've had some really tough situations, and the more clarity we can offer, the better.
Mr. Vincent.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, one thing I wanted to add, in addition to Mr. Hansen's comments regarding grading, I was sitting at the same hearings that Councilmember House was sitting through regarding problems that had occurred on grading projects, and I wanted to point out a couple different things that this new ordinance is bringing into an ordinance as opposed to just a condition of approval. You'll see on page 14 of the draft ordinance that provisions regarding protection of adjacent property, stormwater control measures, these are measures that go beyond just what's the beginning grade look like and what's the finished grade look like, but goes on how the grading occurs during the life of the project. And those were the areas that you really were experiencing problems during the course of construction, where best management practices weren't always followed. Our conditions of approval, the city's swamp, as well as now this grading ordinance, will formalize those provisions much more to give greater protection both to water quality measures as well as adjacent parcels during the course of construction. One other thing I do want to point out, just so we don't miss this in our procedures today, the building code adopting an ordinance has a couple different revisions that were brought to you today. On page 7, in subsection L, there's a section 105.1.4 regarding building relocation permits. That section is proposed for removal. And on page 11 of your draft ordinance, there are two sections that have been renumbered. The number 2 had been repeated so that it just moves to correct that error. And finally, on page 13, the Appendix J that we were just talking about, grading, was also misidentified as K, not N.
Got it.
So when it comes time for adoption, if those revisions
Include
would be
those
brought forward.
revisions. Okay, and the last thing I wanted to ask, and it goes outside of the actual codes themselves, but it's something I asked the other day about something similar, and that was, what is our process then for after this is adopted by City Council and then it's going to go into effect on January 1st? What's our process of communicating? You mentioned working with AIA, with certainly contractors, electricians, et cetera, et cetera. What is the city planning on doing to be able to communicate with the kind of trainings you've been going through at the state level? What do we have in mind?
Madam Chair, committee members, we've been publishing in our DART letters, those projects going to Planning Commission, since last January, the fact that, you know, new building codes will be coming into effect January 1st and that new regulations may change some of the features of their projects. We've sent out, since July, or even before July, we've sent out numerous emails to our development community that we have an email relationship with, our LDT, Land Development Team email bulletin. We've had advertisements in our local contractors and AIA's associations newsletters. We've gone to their meetings informing all of them that, you know, changes are coming, they're sweeping. It's not just your ordinary 3-year minor update schedule. So we've been, you know, we have notices available at the counter. We're going to be, in fact, we sent a copy of this draft ordinance a week ago to the AIA chapter, the Contractors Association. We've sent the grading chapters to several of our local civil engineers that specialize in grading. I've talked to several of them, and they don't see any problems with the amendments as proposed, and we've been trying to definitely get the word out that, you know, there's new codes coming, and you can basically take your old stuff and set it off to the side because it's different.
Good. I would hope perhaps one of the other things you might offer, or at least consider, is some kind of a briefing or opportunity to get some of the folks together in a room and just walk them through it, and you know, just to really make it clear as it can be, because these are very important and big changes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Barnwell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I didn't quite understand, Mr. Vincent. You said that on page 7, 105.1.4 is being removed? And
That's correct.
What's the theory behind that? We don't need to have any permits for relocating buildings, or is it covered somewhere else?
The reason for its removal is that our former code actually went beyond just requiring a building permit, but also had conditions that have since been preempted by state law. And so what ended up happening is we just recognized that in this adoption process after the ordinance was prepared, we're removing that to avoid that kind of conflict.
Okay, thank you. On page 3, 903.2.18.1 general, it says automatic fire sprinkler systems shall be installed and maintained in operable condition in all buildings except residential buildings containing 4, first place just being an English major, 4, it should be 4 or fewer dwellings, 4 or fewer dwellings where any of the following occur. So we're saying that if you have 4 units, you don't have to have sprinklers, but if you have 5, you do. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
And
Excuse me.
how does the fire hazard dramatically change so much? And why wouldn't we want the 4-unit or the 3-unit? Indeed, for a 5,000 square foot building, why wouldn't we want the single residential house to be covered?
Madam Chair, council members, this in the building code is language that the fire code has in it in our local adopted ordinance, so I'm going to let Mr. Poirier
Mr.
speak to that since it's his.
Madam Chair, Committee Member Barnwell, that is our existing sprinkler ordinance, and it is our intent to come back in 2008 with a much more stringent sprinkler ordinance that will cover even single-family residences. Part of the reason that, and we didn't want to adopt this entirely new code with all these new requirements and at the same time bring in a new sprinkler ordinance. And part of the reason for that is that we wanted to make sure that we gave the public plenty of advance notice, that we were able to daylight it and make sure that that any interested stakeholder could voice their opinion or basically tell us and you how they felt it should go. So it is our intent to come back with a sprinkler ordinance that will cover everything, 0 square footage and residential, all residential.
And single-family dwellings.
And single-family
That's
dwellings.
Big, huge change, right?
Yeah, the most interesting thing about the sprinkler ordinance that we have planned is that it will also, as written now, and we do have it drafted up, it will also require sprinklers for houses that have a remodel or addition that's over 50% of the existing square footage. And if anything would be controversial about it, it would be that.
Well, thank you, because that's been it's been on my mind, and I know when I'm on the campaign trail, and so I'm going to candidate forums and talking to people who live up in the high fire hazard areas. And the arbitrary drawing of a line that, 4 units, you don't have to worry about, 5 you do, it is indeed just arbitrary and doesn't seem to benefit the public health and safety. So I'm looking forward to getting a bigger sweeping coverage of that. How are eaves and eave protections covered? What does it say? Are they truly non-combustible, or is it just the cover that's non-combustible?
We went into great detail when we discussed this, and at the moment I'm not bringing the details to mind, but I believe that 7A covers the eaves in much the same way that our old ordinance did, and that is basically that the eaves have to be boxed. What we don't want is an open eave where fire can get up underneath and run the rafters. There are some additional provisions now for ventilation of eaves, because a lot of cathedral ceilings and open ceilings and that kind of thing on the interior of houses have changed the way ventilation works in houses. But you see, we don't have necessarily the attic vents that we used to have. So in a lot of cases we're allowing eave vents and so forth, but the eaves themselves are handled in the same way.
But non-combustible eaves are not boxed eaves. A boxed eave is not a non-combustible eave, is it?
Correct. No, a boxed eave could be done, with a combustible wood or something like that.
So are we requiring non-combustible eaves in all construction? That's where I'm going. That was a big point made in the San Diego fires. And when we talk about non-combustible, does that mean we stucco, or what does that mean?
Well, non-combustible, and you have to be careful with that term, because it can be a non-combustible coating. For instance, stucco in many instances is considered non-combustible, but the construction is not considered non-combustible. For instance, a stucco can be breached, and if there's wood behind it, it's not considered non-combustible construction. It's simply a coating. And if, in order to achieve non-combustible construction, the current building code talks about like type 1 construction, type 2 construction, steel, iron, concrete, or masonry, that type of thing. And single-family residences just aren't made non-combustible. They're always going to be combustible to a degree. Again, the coating on the outside can be made fire resistive or non-combustible to a degree, but that's not going to make the eave non-combustible. Probably the rafters are still going to be wood.
Well, I want to go a little bit further on this because of the tragedies down in San Diego, and so much of the discussion has been associated with land use as well as building codes, et cetera. So what are we saying about a house in a high fire hazard area that has eave overhangs? What are our code requirements for those? Are they to be non-combustible or kind of, sort of, or not? What is it?
That's something that I'll have to actually go back to the building code and research to make sure that I have a clear
Mr.
understanding.
Hanson, what?
Mr. Vincent also.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Committee Member Barnwell, right now, what the eaves are not allowed if they're within 1/3 the distance where protection of openings is required. That sounds kind of complicated, but for instance, in a residence, that's going to be either 3 feet or 5 feet from the property line, depending upon whether it's a 1-hour wall with openings or not. So if it's 3 feet, the eaves could only extend 1 foot, so you'd have a 2-foot gap between the property line. And if they extended farther than that, they would have to be a 1-hour construction, which is basically your wood frame with stucco around it. Farther back from that, there's not any requirements for protection of eaves other than if you have vents in them for attics and those types of things. You have to have materials resistance to the intrusion of embers, which is basically a 1/4-inch screen across those vents.
So, but that sounds like the ordinance is designed to prevent the fire, because it's associated with the property line. It seems to be the theory being preventing the fire from crossing the property line to an adjacent parcel rather than protecting the building itself. If we were trying to protect the building itself from the dangers associated with eave overhang, it wouldn't matter where that building sat, whether it was close to the property line or deep within the property. Or am I missing something there?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Vincent.
Sorry to interrupt, but I have the building code in front of me. And the eave protection section reads, eaves and soffits shall meet the requirements of SFM 12-7A-3. I'll let those gentlemen explain what that is. Or shall be protected by ignition-resistant materials or non-combustible construction on the exposed underside.
And if I may, with due respect to Mr. Vincent, I believe that was 704A.2.3. And that's the provision that we've proposed in previous talks to delete. And again, this was 6 months ago, and I don't remember the exact details of where we felt that the coverage was elsewhere in the code. But we'll definitely have to go back and look at where exactly that is.
Did you have the coverage? You mentioned earlier that the coverage was in the city's wildland fire plan. Is that correct? Am I jogging anyone's memories?
It is, the wildland fire plan is not a construction
be in
code,
there.
so it's
So
not
you don't
something
have
that
it
we
there.
would enforce as part of the building code.
Okay.
It's a different type of document than that. But one of the things that we can do and should do clearly is make sure that what isn't covered by the state is covered by our local ordinances. And that's something that, we've been working at this since January, so, I'm obviously losing a little bit of the detail in the discussions. But I think that one thing that we should do here is go back and revisit those discussions just to make sure that all of the things that we agreed on with the building department and fire department are what we need to adopt.
Well, that'd be great. I'd appreciate it because, we should. We're at this point to be changing these things, and it's on everyone's mind what happened down in San Diego. Overhanging eaves were a significant component of how they thought some of these fires started. And the high fire hazard areas that we're talking about now, et cetera, I would really be curious to know in depth and detail whether we are actually addressing them rigorously. And so when we come back to the council on this, if we could have that discussion, I'd greatly appreciate it. A couple of more, Madam Chair. The demolition permit discussion on page 8, how does this mesh with our city demolition? I don't see reference to our city demolition permit, and should there be a reference to it, or is this, how do these two work?
Madam Chair, Commissioner Barnwell, Committee Member Barnwell, excuse me. This is what our demolition ordinance in the building code currently says.
Okay.
And I don't believe that when we drafted the ordinance through the zoning department, the demolition zoning ordinance, that there was any conflicts with it that I remember. So this is just language that was brought straight forward from our current
Well, one of the things, and I don't know, maybe this is reading it too close, but I know one of the things on our demo permit is that it may be a historical structure, and so there has to be like a Class 1 or Class 3 review of historical lists, et cetera, which isn't referenced here. So, well, Mr. Estrella or Mr.
Madam Chair, I'm happy to
Vincent?
answer that. The part of the process is that before the demolition permit can be issued is that there's this zoning compliance process that's outlined in Chapter 2268 and now 2269 of the municipal code. So there are two different layers going on. These provisions are dealing with the details of the demolition, how it's going to occur, what kind of how you're dealing with utilities that you discover and so forth once the demolition permit is issued. Prior to that, the zoning compliance has to occur.
Okay. I guess that's okay.
So it's a two-step process, is what you're saying.
On page 9, building number 1, under building number 1, I was not under the impression that you could have a 10-foot high, non-permitted building. Am I reading that right? One-story detached residential accessory structures, permit requirements in this code is how we start out for, and exceptions to it. And I want to be sure I'm reading that right. Exceptions to the permit requirements. And the number 1 is that a structure that's less than 120 square feet and shorter than 10 feet. Is that our rule now?
Madam Chair, Commissioner Barnwell, Committee Member Barnwell, yes, that's our current language,
Okay.
our current exemption.
And now, how about the fences? Are we actually saying here on number 2 that if you build a 5-foot tall grape stake fence, you need a permit for that?
That's correct.
Wow.
And again, that's current language brought forward from from the past and matches the zoning ordinance.
How about things like concrete flat work? Notwithstanding that it may have a cost associated with it greater than $300. Is that, I always think of that as exempt from permits. Is it or not?
It is exempted other than for the zoning review for driveways because they look at it for the amount of concrete in the front yard and those types of things.
Okay.
They have their own criteria for it.
I think those are the only comments that I had. I also, like everyone else said, I want to say that it's good work. The grading stuff is pretty. I'm glad you guys poured over that because that's a little bit tricky. And Mr. House is correct. I don't think I realized till just now that we don't inspect the grading. Is that what you just said? We don't inspect it. We have the on-site architect engineer do the inspection and then report back to us about it?
Madam Chair, committee members, we don't have any inspectors that are licensed surveyors or civil engineers, so they can't do the detail, make sure the elevation is to within the foot or everything. They do go out and do general inspections and look at general conformance, but as far as the strict pad elevations, no. So we do require professionals that have that capacity.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'll be ready to make a motion, Madam Chair, when you're ready to have one made.
Go right ahead. I just have a couple of quick comments, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, I would like to make a motion and that we approve these changes to the building code with the additional housekeeping that Mr. Vincent mentioned, the removal of a couple sections as per what he suggested.
I'll second that to move this to the City Council.
Okay, great. We have a motion and a second. I just have a couple of quick things. I, too, was a bit surprised when I heard that we don't have any grading inspectors on staff. That is a little bit surprising. And I know that we are a built-out environment, but we have the Rogers tracks, which I get to look at every day the last 15 years, and will for the next, I suppose. And we have St. Francis, and we have Cottage Hospital, and we have, a number of fairly large things. And grading is a huge deal. And I've done a lot of work over the years with folks at the county. And, of course, it's a totally different environment. But that's one of those sort of big 900-pound issues that happens at the county, and I can't imagine that it's too much different here in the city. I mean, it really does affect the stability of everything that goes on, and I know we have our SWIP, we like to use the the acronym, but it's our stormwater management program, basically. And if it's not graded properly, then all your runoff just creates havoc. So I'm really hopeful that the system that you've set up is one where we have full confidence in the work that gets done, because it's the foundation. It's absolutely critical. So to find out that we don't have anyone on staff, I understand, makes me a little uncomfortable, but if you have full confidence in the system, Mr. Estrella, then I trust you implicitly.
Yes, Madam Mayor, we absolutely do. The provisions of the grading ordinance, as Mr. Hanson stated, provides us with the tools that we believe to ensure that the grading that is taking place would be in conformance with the codes and, of course, with the approved plans. Just want to reiterate, as far as grading, we do inspect grading to a certain extent, but we're talking extensive grading. We're talking massive amount of earth. In these particular large, extreme projects, we believe licensed professionals are the correct individuals to come in. They're putting their license on the line. They report to us. We review the reports to ensure that they're accurate and correct. So we feel pretty confident at this point.
And I guess it would work the same way with a city project. I'm specifically thinking of the Arroyo Burro estuary restoration, which was the moving of an awful lot of earth in some parts. I mean, they took out what diameter was that? Like an 8-foot diameter culvert or something like that. It was with an extensive reach of, a couple hundred feet.
That project was handled through our Public Works Department, and so that went through a different review and inspection process.
Okay. All righty. I have one more question, and then Mr. House has something else for you. I notice in your summary that we got, and thank you for that, it's very easy reading, but in Section 3, Plumbing Code F, you talk about the current requirement to disconnect from private sewer systems, which are septics, when a public sewer becomes available. And you define availability of the public system as within 200 feet of the abutting property. Now, I didn't find a corresponding language in the code here, so I was a little surprised to see it here. But I'm kind of wondering, if you have a sewer line that's within 200 feet and then you've got a whole bunch of houses, I'm thinking of Yankee Farm. How do we? I mean, why aren't they captured under this? Because they've got to have a sewer line somewhere in the surrounding area of Campanile Hills Estates and so forth. Maybe not over on the Allen Road, but certainly somewhere going along that area. How come they're not captured within this? And how do we
Madam Chair,
gently get them to do it?
that's been a struggle for a long time for us. There's also another section of the municipal code under the Public Works Department that gives exceptions based on the cost of doing that. We've wanted, and this is again continuing.
I understand it's
current
continuing
language,
policy, right?
And the 200 feet in a lot of cases in some of those properties that are quite large, and the word abutting, abutting means it's immediately adjacent. So if it's down the street, it's not abutting their property. So there's all kinds of little fine lines and hairs in there that get split during that, because it can be potentially pricey.
It is pricey. It's absolutely true, but it's probably going to be necessary at some point. All right, well, I don't have anything else. It's all good work, all technical work, and I know that my little electric box that I had to replace yesterday, we went and got the permit today. Thank you for the emergency opportunity to not have my house burned down, because I have open eaves and all that stuff, and it would have been a mess. But we're all good to go, so thank you. Mr. House.
Just one more thing, and one thing that happens it gets addressed sometimes in the conditions of approval on projects, but when grading's done, dirt may be brought to the site, dirt may leave the site, but certainly trucks come and go, and they carry with them often quite a bit of, accumulate quite a bit of debris in the roadbed, in the roads to and from. And so we've dealt with that on large projects in the conditions of approval. I don't see any reference to that in here in any way, but there's, I mean, it seems like some of these get real close to talking about that kind of a thing, but don't go across that line. During construction, there's an impact on the surrounding community of that nature, and there's no requirement in here to clean it up. And is this just the wrong place for something like that? Is it really something that will only show up in the in a particular project's conditions of approval if it has a development permit? I mean, where?
Madam Chair, Committeeman House, that would be covered under our erosion and sedimentation control plan that we apply to every construction project.
Got it.
And also the Public Works has the same policy. It is referenced in this code. We didn't put it in this code because we felt we wanted to keep the flexibility in being able to apply different BMPs on a project-by-project basis. So we have the reference to the erosion sedimentation control plan, which does things like the construction truck entrances and the wash-offs, and then the Public Works also deals with if it actually does get onto the road, being able to bring.
So this references best management practices that are essentially encoded elsewhere, and actually implemented elsewhere.
That's correct.
Okay, that settles it for me. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we have a long list of where to take the dirt. For instance, most of it has to go to a recycling center as opposed to into the landfill, and there are runoff requirements. I mean, all of this stuff so it doesn't go into the creeks. And I mean, that's all taken care of in separate documents, right?
Madam Chair, that's correct, yes.
Okay, all right. Anything else? Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you very much for all your hard work and your
Thank you.
coordination with the other departments. Thanks a lot. We're adjourned.